I grew up in Edmonton, and at that time, which is to say the 1940s, Edmonton was a relatively small town. It probably had a population not dissimilar to the one Kelowna enjoys right now, so small. And exposure to fine art was completely out of the question. I think there might have been an Edmonton Art Gallery, but if there was, it operated out of a house, an old house in the downtown core. Nothing like the grand Art Gallery of Alberta that we see today, so there was none of that. My exposure to culture at the time was at the bottom end of the scale. It was popular culture. So AM pop radio and comic books and Saturday afternoon movies, that sort of thing. That was my introduction to culture of any kind. I spent the last summer, graduating from high school, I spent that summer in the Arctic, in the Beaufort Sea, and came back right at the end of August, unsure of what I was going to do. Well, at that time, the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology and Art had an art program, which I knew virtually nothing about, but I had displayed some talent in the area of drawing through my school years. And my parents said, well, maybe you should consider something in the area of commercial art. So down I went to the Alberta College of Art and was interviewed by the then head, Illingworth Kerr, who said, well, maybe if we get enough students, we can add another section and that sort of thing. Well, a day later, the phone rang and down I went and enrolled in my first year of the four-year program at the Alberta College of Art. At that time, still the Provincial Institute of Technology and Art. Thinking that I would probably go into commercial art. At that time, that first year was a common program. All students went through it, and then they fed into either the craft area or the fine art area or commercial art. Well, it wasn't a month into the program that I realized that it was fine art that I was drawn to, and specifically painting. In those days, there was no question about painting being the big kid on the block. So I was determined at that point to pursue art and to become a painter. I use acrylic. I paint in acrylic, and that's probably inappropriate for what I do. I'm doing realistic paintings that require, generally speaking, a fair amount of blending. That is to say, working one value or color into another. And that requires the paint to stay relatively wet for a period of time. Acrylic is made, or at least in the beginning years, it was developed first of all in Mexico by David Alfaro Siqueiros, one of the Mexican mural painters, and he worked out the formula for it along with technicians, I suppose, chemists, for doing wall murals. Well, it was just fine, but it was taken on by the first generation of pop artists and color field painters, all of the artists that were more or less on the cutting edge. Well, in my, I guess, third year, I was introduced to acrylic. I remember a representative of, I believe, the Rowney Paint Company from England, who was coming across Canada, visiting the art schools, and he had a film that had the famous British pop artist Peter Blake. Peter Blake did the cover for the Sgt. Pepper album. He's probably as well known for that as anything these days, but the film with Blake extolling the virtues of this brand new and exciting medium. Well, I thought, foolishly at the time, that might be a good idea to pursue that. I'd been trained for, at that point, almost 2 years in oil painting techniques, and instead I veered sharply to the right and took up acrylic, which has proved a challenging medium to use for the kind of work I do. Most realists today are using oil paint. It makes so much more sense, but I use acrylic, and at the Alberta College of Art is where I was first introduced to it. The school at the time was it was a school in flux because it found itself at the end of what we might call traditional art training, which is to say drawing from plaster casts and doing courses in anatomy and composition and all of that. Coming out of that and moving into a period in which modernism ruled the day, which is to say a lot less importance placed on some of those skills. So the school was right at that dividing point, that balance. And so we like to think we received a fairly solid and more or less traditional background in art. In fact, I think it wasn't. It wasn't fully that, nor was it fully a program that celebrated the brand new that was being done, certainly on this continent. Generally speaking, I think it's in art. It's in art. I think a lot of art today goes out of its way to respond to social conditions, to give only one example, but things outside of the discipline of art or video or performance, whatever the discipline might be. I've always built paintings with a lot of attention paid to the art that's preceded the art I'm making. So initially it was a question of figuring out how to make art that paid attention to the tenets of modernism without doing paintings that simply imitated the flavor of the day, which was abstract expressionism was ending, but then color field painting came along and minimal art and those formalist abstraction generally. So I began making realist paintings, but with a lot of attention paid to some of the principles of modernism. Earlier in my career, my paintings were done from direct observation. Having spent a few classes drawing from plastered casts, it seemed to me that that's the way you made a painting. You set up, in my case, a still life. You looked at that still life and you translated it into, first of all, lines on the canvas, and then the lines were filled in with sort of wash underpainting, and then heavier layers of paint on top of that. But it was all a question of seeing and then recording, seeing, recording, seeing, recording. Photography, it's hard to believe today, it would be virtually impossible to believe today that there was ever a time when photography wasn't fully embraced by the world of so-called fine art. But that was the case even as late as the 1960s. The discussions were about whether photography should be considered in any way equal to painting, sculpture, even printmaking. So at the time, the thought of working from photographs was completely out. After Cézanne died, and just an amusing aside, after Cézanne's death, they went into his studio and they found tucked under his palette photographs of the mountains that he'd been painting. The assumption was always that he was out there painting directly from observation of the mountain, but no, he had photographic sources. In any event, as my career went along, about halfway through, I decided that photography could be a useful aid. Since then, I have prepared images, either, well, first of all, still lives, which I arrange, then photograph. The photograph is worked in some fashion. Today, it's heavily worked using Photoshop. Then the image is projected onto a screen using, today, a digital projector. A line drawing is done. That'll take 3, sometimes 4 hours to complete. And then I move on to the painting process, and that can take a painting, say 5 feet square, will take a couple of months. Smaller paintings, a little less time, but they're fairly time intensive. I think exhibitions of this kind, which is to say a fairly large survey, it covers almost 5 decades, and has 70 paintings in it, the earliest one having been done in 1969, and the most recent was finished about a week ago. The varnish is barely dry, and so it covers the full span of my career. An exhibition of this kind can be very useful to viewers, I think, in understanding a particular piece. They can see where the painting they're considering has come from, and by going a few paintings into the future, they can see what it led to. So it can be very, very useful that way. Also, there have been a number of themes in my work. For example, I have used what some would call kitsch sky backgrounds in paintings. And I insert those in order to generally create mood and sometimes just to create a fairly deep pictorial space. But I started using that device in, I think, 1978. It was, I believe, the first time I inserted a photographic background into a painting. And since then I have used it fairly consistently, not in every painting, but it turns up over and over and over again. And what fun in an exhibition like this, just to do a tour of the exhibition looking for that particular ploy. And it can be fun. The most recent painting in the exhibition, titled Tempting Fate, has in the very deep background a stormy sky, and a gray, green, rain-filled sky, and that's the most recent iteration of this ploy of mine. And sandwiched between the stormy background sky and 3 burning candles in the foreground is a clump of grapes. Now, whatever the connection between the grapes, the candles, a tooled tin Mexican flaming heart, and the stormy sky might be, I don't know, but it should be of some amusement to viewers to consider what the relationships might be.